You're listening to Leadership Powered by Common Sense with your host, Doug Thorpe. Here's Doug.
Well, hey, everybody. Good to have you again. This is Doug Thorpe, and you're on another episode of Leadership Powered by Common Sense. Today, my guest is a gentleman who is a keynote speaker and a leadership coach, advisor, thought leader. His name is Larry Mietus. Larry, you go by Leadership Larry, so we'll talk about that. But welcome to the show.
Doug, thank you so much. My pleasure to be here.
Yeah, it's a little bit of a tradition on this show, Larry. I'd like to ask my guests to give us a quick story arc of your background and your journey to get to where you are right now. And, how did you formulate and inspire what you're doing right now?
Sure. Well, I consider myself to be very fortunate. When I look over my shoulder of all the jobs I've had in my life, there were probably only two that I absolutely hated and lasted 3 days and quit. But I've always been intrigued by marketing and advertising, and I'd like to think I'm an extrovert and good with people. And I was a junior in college at the State University of New York at Buffalo. Clearly remember sitting at the kitchen table one night doing my homework, miserable and ready to drop out of school. And my mom looked at me that night and said, "Well, for the rest of your life, what do you want to get paid to do?" And I said, "You know what? If I could get paid to talk, like sign me up. I am there." So I went back and I went to another university in town that had a formal media journalism program. And they actually said, "Don't come to school here," which I was shocked. They said, "Look, we graduate 300 people a year with a degree. Most of them don't get jobs. Go back to UB, find a counselor, tell them you've got 2.5 years under your belt. You want to customize your degree." So the year I graduated with close to 30,000 students, I was the only person who had my degree. I did a bachelor's in communication. I called it sports communication, and I did a minor in advertising and public relations. But to get through college without student loans, I worked in restaurants and bars, supper clubs, not crazy party bars, because those people don't tip well. And I paid my way through school. But it was sort of at that point in my life, I really think, where I realized in my own DNA, I had a mentality for servant leadership. And I wanted to serve people, clearly. And I wanted to connect people. And I wanted to help people find their place and their meaning and be happier and be successful. So, that was like the beginning of the aha for me. And I worked in media for a number of years. I worked in radio sales on air. I worked in newsprint. I worked in outdoor billboard advertising. Tried to crack into television. Couldn't do it. Didn't do it. Set a timeline for it and literally walked away. And I've been involved in higher education now for 29 years. And one of the best jobs I ever had in corporate America was at a college system called Bryant Stratton College. And I was there 10 years, phenomenal people, and went back to school for my master's in organizational leadership. First cohort that Medallion University produced, so we were 001. The good news is we were the guinea pigs. The bad news is we were the guinea pigs. And then walked away from Bryant and Stratton and said, "I'm going to go into this consulting world." So I was fortunate. I have a cousin who's maybe 13, 14 years older than I am. He had a local consulting business here in Western New York. So I worked for him for 4 years. And then just one day said, "You know what? I'm just going to hang my shingle up and go out and do my own thing." And that was 15 years ago. So really wanted to. My boys were in high school at the time. And I realized, kind of like the cats in the cradle, there's going to come a point in life where they're not going to have time for me, and I'm going to wish I had time for them or had given them more time. So being an independent business consultant, author, speaker allowed me to do all that. My oldest child, quite honestly, my daughter, was born with Down syndrome. And when she was very young, we needed a lot of time to understand and learn the therapies and be the best parents we could be. So I glue all that together, and fast forward, that's where we are today. When my mom was alive, she told me I did not have a real job. And she couldn't explain to her girlfriends what I did. I said, look, Mom, just tell them I go into businesses to make them better. They're either already healthy and they want to get better, or they're broken and they're trying to get fixed. That's what I do. Travel around the country, speak a lot about leadership and motivation, obviously. And my book came out, it'll be 5 years in October, and still promoting that and touring with regard to that. So that's kind of the Cliff Notes version of how we got here.
Yeah, I find it fascinating when you talk about the consulting game. As most of my audience knows, my journey also, there was a chapter in consulting, and that is ultimately what led me directly into the executive coaching because what I found my consulting clients, while they wanted to execute on the project they commissioned for me or my team to come do, there was inevitably a leadership challenge. Either they were feeling it or they needed help with the team around them, and things needed to be looked at from a pure leadership standpoint. And often the common thread was people had gotten thrust into their leadership roles somewhat by accident, and they were no more prepared to take that charge than anything. So, everybody goes at it with best efforts, I think, most of the time, and it's a trial by fire sort of thing. You do a few things, you try a few things, they don't work, you're maybe not sure how to fix it. But the bigger kind of tendency is they fall into some kind of rhythm, whether it's really working or not. They find a stride, and that's what they do, and then that's their leadership style. And
Sure.
I just for those on streaming on audio, I just did an air quotes for leadership style, to call it that. But let's talk about some of your observations. And I know we'll tell people the title of your book. I know you allude to it in the content of the book.
Now the book is called, again, air quotes, We Tried That Once. And the subtitle is And Other Popular Excuses That Sabotage Business Success. So I knew for a long time that I wanted to write a book and I couldn't get my head around it and literally danced around with that thought for a decade. And just like a Hallmark movie, I woke up one night at 3 o'clock in the morning and it was right there. There was the title. And I woke up and I wrote it down. And the next day I thought, when I'm talking to prospects, business leaders, business owners, or working with clients, what are these repetitive excuses that I hear? And I wrote them down, 13 of them, and I ranked them in what I thought was order of what I hear the most to the least. And then the whole premise of the book is, you mentioned the word rhythm and stride. I thought, do people just get into these convenient patterns of somebody walks in and goes, yeah, we don't have the right tools. Yep, we don't have enough time. Yep, we don't have enough money. We don't have enough resources. We don't have the right location. We don't have and someone in charge goes, oh, okay. I talked to Doug about that, so take that off the list. And I believe what he's telling me, so we're just going to suffer. And, my whole thought was, can you slow that down for a second, probe a little bit deeper, really find out if this excuse is a convenient excuse that's been bred into the culture, sometimes created by ownership and leadership, or is there really a challenge, a business challenge that we can peel back the layers of the onion, do a root cause analysis, find out what's going on, and figure out how to fix it moving forward? That's really the premise of the book. And it's funny because no matter where I go, no matter who I talk to, as soon as I say to them, we tried that once, they burst out laughing and they say, well, yeah, welcome to my life, welcome to my company, welcome to my world. I mean, it's all of us, myself included. We all make excuses. And then we have to step back and say, well, how much are we relying on them? And if we repaired some of those things, could we get a better result, a different result? I toy with the idea sometimes of writing a follow-up book because there certainly are more than 13 excuses in the world. But I think I've got a lot of mileage left in these 13 excuses. And the thing is, I think personally, professionally, we all know that we use these excuses. on a regular basis, but we don't take the time just to dissect them and try to figure out at least one of them. So, that's really where it came from, how the whole thing popped up. And many of my presentations when I'm out speaking around the country are somehow tied to the book. Some of them aren't. But I've yet to meet a person who said that doesn't apply to me or that doesn't apply to my business.
Right. No, I think it's a very common theme that does happen. And I think to the point of, do we fall into a rhythm or a stride? Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I think it's a combination of what might be your own personal comfort zone. For instance, I've run into a lot of entrepreneurs who learned and now understand it takes a certain amount of risk tolerance to be an entrepreneur. And so while they might have gotten comfortable with taking on a little more risk than the other average guy, um, maybe they're still not comfortable taking the bigger risk that it truly takes to grow a private company. I mean, typically small businesses do not grow in that nice smooth line that you see in business school. They grow in giant stair step leaps. Things like I need to add a facility, or I need to add a new
Right.
machine, or I need to invest in a whole new process or team of people. And those are giant bumps in your P&L, and they don't just smooth line out. So when you're analyzing that, you get into that risk aversion real fast, and that alone is just one element. But I think you sum it all up, and that's where we as coaches get into the talking about limiting beliefs.
Right.
How are you programmed to think about the world around you? And do you have a certain limiting belief? Oh, that'll never work, and it gets back to that. We tried it before, but it'll never work. Well, that's a statement of limiting belief.
Right. Yeah. And when people say that to me, I'm like, okay, talk to me about that. There was a meeting or a series of meetings. Where are the notes from that meeting? Well, we didn't keep those. Okay. How long ago was that? I said, maybe it's a brilliant idea that's ahead of its time. Like somebody sat in a room one day and said, people are going to talk on phones that aren't connected to the wall with a cord. Someone said that somewhere in a meeting. All right. And I taught a college course one time, and it was organizational design, and broke the room into three groups. I had the branches of U.S. government written on the board, and I said, "You have 30 minutes to redesign the U.S. government. That's been around for hundreds of years." Two of the groups, not good. One of the groups, I said, "Take these notes, roll them up, store them, rent a bank deposit box, because this is an idea you could market and sell. This could actually work." They were 18, 19, 20 years old. And it was that whole, you know, could it really work? Maybe, but maybe it's not going to work for 20 years. But
Yeah.
you just don't throw it away. And I think to your point, we're all creatures of habit. We say what we're used to saying, we do what we're used to doing, we go where we're used to going. I had a CEO one time who would send people to trade shows, and then they'd come back, he'd look at the results, and he would chastise them and say, "Well, nobody can sell like I do." And I went in there and I said, "I've got much less experience in this industry than you do. I'm going to go to the next trade show alone, and I'm going to see what I can sell." And not to pat myself on the back, but the results were pretty impressive. And I said, "People aren't getting the results you want because you've intimidated them to the point of they don't even want to try." I
Yeah.
said, it's not your style. That's great. If they're telling the truth and they understand the product and they know the pricing, just let them do it their way and stop telling them that they can't do it as good as you. And it is funny. One time I was paying a property tax bill with one of my corporate checks, and the clerk said to me, she looked at the name of my company, Speaking of Strategy, and she asked me what I do, and she looked at me and it was great, and she said, "Out of all the businesses and all the leaders you've worked with, what do you think the number one problem is that trips these people up?" And I didn't hesitate, and I don't hesitate today. I said, "I think it's ego." I said, when you wake up and tell yourself you know it all and you don't need help to do some of it, and no one can prove you wrong, and you've got all the ideas, it's more than the beginning of the end. And the best leaders in the best companies I've ever been a consultant to, a customer of, they have that servant leadership mentality. They empower the people around them. They trust the talented people that they hired and they get out of their way. And their job as a leader is just to move the barriers that are slowing Doug up, but not doing Doug's job for him. And a lot of people can't get their arms around that.
I totally agree, and sometimes it's comically called founderitis. You created the business. This was your baby, your idea. Nobody knows it better than you do, and all these ideas that are coming at you can't be right because they weren't your idea. And I saw that in my early banking days. I used to be so frustrated by it as a young banker because I would see these owners that would come to the bank and they had this business that was, it was going okay. And then all of a sudden it caught fire and, market share started increasing and opportunities started growing. And, that may last for a couple of years. And then all of a sudden, there was this mystical, invisible wall that they would hit, and the wheels started coming off of what was otherwise a really good business. You had a good client list, you had a good, order pipeline, and yet the business couldn't execute. They couldn't deliver. And then later in my banking career and then turning into consultant, I really started analyzing that because it just bugged me. How can this happen? The very thing that was you wanted to do as a startup, you wanted to be successful, you wanted to have the big topside revenue number. Why doesn't it keep going? Well, inevitably, the common denominator was the owner founder. They weren't willing to delegate. They weren't willing to admit their own limitations. And, some of the most brilliant business moves I've observed over the years is the founder that says, you know what, this company is now in, healthy 7 digit, maybe or early 8 digit revenue. I don't think I'm the CEO anymore. I need to hire a CEO, somebody that can really help me take this to the next level. And, that's a huge ego challenge. And
Sure. Oh,
to step away and get comfortable with saying, owner, founder versus CEO or president or whatever else you want to call it. But again, some of the best moves I've ever seen in business is when the owner founder does just that.
oh,
Or
exactly.
at a
I
minimum,
challenge a lot of the CEOs that I've worked with, including during the pandemic, and I'll say to them, pick a day of the week, try to keep the same day of the week, and work from home. I what's wrong? You've got a team. They've been with you a long time. They know what to do. They know how to open the door, turn on the lights, and transact business. You would get so much more done if people weren't coming up to you every 5 minutes. So stay home and work from home. And most of them can't do it or won't do it. And you're right. I mean, I'm preaching to the choir, and as well as your viewers and listeners. If you're a startup versus growing versus mature versus stagnant versus declining, those businesses all need different skill sets and different mentalities. And I see so many businesses that go, well, we hired Larry 30 years ago. He did the big lift. We can't let him go.
right, right.
Well, maybe we can find him a different role in the organization, or maybe it's time to part ways. Jim Collins always talked about the right people in the right seats on the bus. And I've always added on to that. And I've said, sometimes we have to pull the bus over, open the door, look over our shoulder and say, Larry, Doug, it's time for you to get off. Oh, and Sally and Jim standing on the corner, it's time for you to get on. And then close the door and drive away on that journey of the business. And it's tough. People just become so ingrained in their habits. Um, I worked one time with a very large national financial firm, and they got all their regionals together in one part of the state. And I went in with one mindset of talking about one thing, and over lunch, just listening to them, I threw all that out. And I stood up and I said, "You might fire me on the spot in the next 5 minutes, but here's what I'm hearing that's not being addressed, and we're going to solve it right now and address it." And it was just habitual. They were sort of running old school. We all, every single one of us get on the phone every Monday from 6 to 8 and cold call for business, for clients. And so I said, okay, let's just do basic assumption here. What day of the week are most employees the most miserable? Well, Monday. Well, why is that? Because they went back to work and they don't like their jobs. So they go home miserable. Okay. And what sport, what event is telecast on Monday nights to millions of people all over the country for 10 months of the year? Oh, Monday Night Football. And when does pregame coverage start? Oh, around 7, 7:30. I said, so you're calling the most miserable people in the world who don't want to talk to anybody because they're frustrated, and you're almost impinging on their Monday Night Football time, and you're asking them to trust a total stranger with their money. Let's talk about that. Why maybe it's not work. And you can see it like, poof. But all the VP said, well, that's what we've always done.
Right.
So, Doug, I know the beauty of what we do is, I always tell my prospects and clients, I'm flying over, I'm circling the forest in a helicopter. I'm yelling down to Doug, stop walking, you're going to walk into a tree. But you don't know it's a tree anymore because you've lived in the forest so long, you just don't know. And when those eyes come in like yours that are fresh from the outside world and those ears come in from the outside world, it's not always rocket science that can move them in a different direction. It's just getting out of their own way.
Well, it is, and so much of this is rooted in, you alluded to it earlier, the culture that has been developed at the company, the habits, and I'm going to use the example to start this. I'm going to use the example of one of the big, global brands that I've dealt with. They as a company, they've got a 100-year legacy, and you start talking to some of the leadership team, and what you realize is their definition of success is having watched the guy before them and how they operated and what they did. And that wasn't necessarily warm and fuzzy. It wasn't human centered. It was certainly wasn't servant leadership. It was more of a command and control style. And when I had the chance to work with them, I was actually embedded there for about 3 years, working with various leaders and taking the company through some organizational realignment they were doing. I challenged those ideas. Wait a minute. You say you do that. Well, why? Why do you respond that way? Why do you act that way? And inevitably, 9 times out of 10, it was like, well, that's how the guy before me did it, and that was deemed successful. And the whole purpose of this shift that was going on at the company, they had a new chairman and CEO who had moved in. I mean, he was a homegrown product, but he had been elevated up to chairman and CEO, and he did a 2 year study and said, our culture is not going to position us to support the new generations of talent coming up. They're not going to want to work for us if we keep operating the way we
Right.
do. Plain and simple, they're not going to want to work for us. So we need to change these things. So they did kudos to this guy as leader. He did a huge mandate on culture shift, but it had to start with, it's one thing to put some vision and values on a piece of paper,
hmm
but then you got to start permeating it through the organization. And one of the big things we had to do as a team of coaches, we had to challenge each leader. Well, what do these words mean to you? Do you have the same translation in your mind
Right.
about where these align? And classic example, there was a notion of empowerment in there. Well, this was a big oil and gas company, and the guy out at the refinery sitting there in the control room monitoring the dials. How much empowerment do you want to give that guy? Is he supposed to play with the dials and do something? No,
Yeah.
you don't want to do that, So that opened up a much deeper discussion about what these values really meant, and they had to do that work before they could really, turn it on, if you will.
Yeah, and it's amazing the assumptions that are made. And so, again, this is where fresh eyes and ears from the outside world can help out. I had an international manufacturing client one time, and they called me up and they said, "Okay, we're going to elevate. We have two guys, two VPs. We're high on both of them. We're going to elevate only one of them to executive vice president. But we're so close to this, we can't figure it out. We want you to help us figure it out." Fine. I go in there, sat them down separately in a room, conference room, spent 10 minutes with each one, went to HR, said, "Fred's your guy, Joe's not your guy." They said, "You were in there 10 minutes, 20 minutes tops." I said, "Mm-hmm." They said, "We're paying you for this." I said, "Mm-hmm." I said, "Fred's your guy." "Well, why are you so sure?" I said, "Because I asked Joe one simple question. Does he want the position?" And he said no. And then he looked at me and said, "That's funny, Larry. You don't even work here, and you're the first person to ask me that." He said, "I don't want the position. I don't need the extra stress. I don't want the extra money. I'm happy where I am." But no one ever asked me until you walked in. And so sometimes they're just so in their own way, which is understandable. We're human beings. But I'm like, wow, give me more opportunities like that. But yeah, it's just, we're humans. And there's a lot of concern, panic, uncertainty about AI. I've been saying, I've been writing articles, and I say AI means always interested. Are you the leader who's always interested? Not just when it's convenient, not just when times are good, not just because you haven't circled the floor, the plant in a few days and talked to people. Are you always genuinely interested in the people that are working with you and around you? And a laptop can't fake that. Chat GPT can tell you what to say, but once you say it the wrong way, because it's not coming from your heart and your brain, people are going to take a step back from you. And it was funny you mentioned, generations coming up. I read an article last night. Same thing. Gen Z is clearly saying we refuse to work for incompetent leadership. We'll jump jobs every month if we have to. We want to learn from talented people. We want exposure to talented leaders on day one, not 6 months in. And if I can't find that in this company, I'm leaving.
Yeah.
And they are.
And on that point, combining those two thoughts you just shared, the whole advent of AI coming in, I have run into a whole wave of young entrepreneurs that believe they can build an entire company with AI.
Mhm.
And they can have these agents that, do the cold calling and do the texting and do the lead gen and do the work. And the central theme I'm getting from a lot of these guys is I can wipe out my middle management. I might still need some front end people to
Mhm.
actually take the final call, close the deal, and sign the papers, but I don't need all this middle management stuff. And I did my own very informal survey. I've got 5 kids, and we were having a big dinner one night, and I threw that out there. I said, "Hey, posit me this. What if the company you work for announced they were eliminating all the middle managers because they were replacing it with AI? So it would be you and the owner at the top. You know, what do you think about that?" And they all, my crew, all without exception, said, "I'd quit." And I asked them why. Why would that not be a good deal? They said, "Because there's nobody to learn from. There's nobody to model. There's nobody to above me that has deeper understanding of the business or the industry. And I want an opportunity to learn and grow myself. And if you're telling me you're going to wipe out all the middle and upper managers that could give me that, I don't want to work there."
Yeah, I've always said, and it was difficult. I understand, when we worked our way through the pandemic, but I'm still saying, I say to my children are 32, 30, and 25, and when I'm out in the world, I say to people, look, the magic still happens on the way to the car in the parking lot, at the water cooler, in the men's room. That's where the magic still happens. When somebody says, "Hey, I like what you just said. Here's my card. Call me." Or, "Could I ask you this, but I didn't want to ask you in front of 300 other people." And, one of my concerns, not to paint the younger generations, millennials and Gen Zs, with a broad brush stroke. But one of my concerns is they don't see that. It's either all on their phone or it's going to be in AI. And their ability to network, granted, was severely impacted by the pandemic, but we've got to teach them those skills. How to build someone's trust before they sign your contract or hire you or purchase your products or services. And sometimes some of that happens after 5 p.m. It might be 7 p.m., heaven forbid. And that doesn't mean the whole generation thinks that way. But when I compare how I built my business, how I was raised to do business, the leaders I emulated, the leaders I ran from, and you filter that over 30, 40 years, you start to see this pattern of the most successful companies with the best consistent results have this type of leadership mindset. And the other ones don't. And it's clearly evident. I mean, you talked about, Doug, habits and strides and routines. I mean, let's look at Southwest Airlines. They're breaking a 50-year tradition when it comes to their seating pattern. But 80% of the flyers they surveyed who did not fly their airline said, this is the only reason I'm not flying your airline. You fix that, you get my business. So
Yeah.
thank goodness they put their egos on the shelf and said, okay, we're going to alter the model a little bit and see what happens.
Yeah.
We're living in exciting times. My humble opinion is I always say to people, how do we get here in today's version of leadership? And I go back to, unfortunately, the tragic events of September 11th. The day after, organizational psychologists all over the world said the ripple effect of this from management leadership building bench strength inside of organizations is going to be 4 decades, 40 years of people going, I don't want management. I don't want fast track. I don't want ownership or leadership. I want to go to work, get paid, and go home and enjoy my community and my family, which is fine. But then we fast forwarded to '07, '08, '09, and families, especially with children, saw mom and dad and grandma and grandpa almost lose everything or lose everything when the market crashed. So they said, well, this loyalty to work idea and putting money in a 401k, that doesn't seem like the smartest thing to do. So I don't want leadership, ownership, and management. And, then fast forward, we, had the pandemic and we're still coming out of that. My favorite question to ask people now is your business performing better than, the same as, or less than your pre-pandemic level? And pretty much everyone says to me, less than. And we can't figure out how to get back on track. So, the challenges we have of, to your point, raising leaders and teaching leaders and grooming folks for that type of responsibility and stress, quite honestly, it's a huge challenge. It's a big, big lift. And to wipe out an entire section, to your point, of management, I don't think is going to be the answer.
Right. No. And related to what you were saying there in that trajectory of history, I've done a lot of work in the entrepreneur through acquisition space where, on the one side, there's this, some are calling it the silver tsunami, all the boomers that have built businesses that want to exit. There is no generational handoff to consider for whatever reason. And therefore, either they just simply close the business or they try to position it to be acquired. And if you look just at the numbers, the government tells us there's trillions of dollars tied up in that segment of the economy. So you could argue there's some amazing opportunity for the right person. And those that are clamoring to come into that market are the classic, corporate person who has worked maybe the 8, 10, 12, maybe up to 15 years and decided, I don't want the corporate trajectory that's before me. I
Right.
don't want those headaches. I do have a little nest egg that I could invest, and so maybe I will go buy one of these businesses. But the interesting dynamic that I've observed is that it's way more than a financial analysis. You can look at the business, you can get the numbers, and you can say, "Oh, this business is generating 500,000 cash every year. What a deal! If I'm the owner of that, look at me. I just 3x'd my take home. And and be able to do that for fairly minimal investment based on all the financing options that are out there. But it immediately derails when you start getting into the emotional side of it. And one dimension is the buyer has to be incredibly sensitive to the legacy the seller thinks they've got, because the sellers have literally invested their whole life building this business. So it's almost like the child that's grown up, but now if you're the seller, you're putting it up for adoption. And what do I do with that?
Sure.
There's a notion I won't have control anymore, and what about this? What about that? So on and so on. And if the buyer can't adequately address that from a pure psycho-emotional standpoint, the deal's not going to happen. The seller's not going to get comfortable, and they literally would rather close it down than give it to you because you haven't made me comfortable with any of
Right.
this.
Right.
So
Right.
it's a strange and interesting phenomenon that's just fraught with all of these leadership issues we've been talking about. Um, Really interesting stuff.
Yeah, there's a family business in my wife's family, and depending on what you read, 80 to 85% of the companies in the United States are family businesses, including some behemoths like Ford Motor Company and Hershey Chocolate and Little Caesars Pizza, still technically family businesses. And in her family, there might be a string of seven, eight grandchildren, and all of them said to Grandpa, the owner, and his son, "Oh, we don't want any part of this." And when they were flabbergasted first, they thought, well, probability and statistics, there's got to be one out of the seven that want it. No. And they all said the same thing. They said, when we watched how hard you worked, when you worked on holidays, when you worked till midnight, when you had to jump through a hoop because so and so called, we don't want any part of that.
Right.
We'd rather go to school, take on debt, try to figure out our own careers. We're not going to do that. And, in '07, '08, '09, my banking contacts and friends were honest enough to say to me when portfolios were crashing and they were closing businesses, they said, we're guilty as bankers of being seduced and enamored with the passion of the entrepreneurs. But Doug comes in on Monday and he's all excited about the paperclip business, and we loan him money. And on Wednesday, Doug's excited about the next great opportunity, sort of forgetting that he's got a paperclip company to try to run and make profitable. And I've said for decades, I think the future of our country is entrepreneurship. But the passion doesn't always translate into the skill set needed for running a business. And you mentioned it earlier. That's tough for somebody to say, I own this, but I don't necessarily run this, nor do I have to. Yeah, it's definitely challenging times, and some people are adapting really well. I'm always amazed, Doug. I don't know about you, but I sort of call it the lack of market research, where somebody has that aha moment and goes, "No one in the world is doing this. I'm going to do that." And then 5 minutes later, I pull up my laptop and go, "Well, what about these 10 companies? They do that." And they're like, "Oh." I'm amazed by how many people still see their business in like a 5 mile radius around it, and they don't think about the rest of the planet.
Right. Well, I've got an interesting story along that line. In the right around late 90s, early 2000s, I was still heavily involved out of my old banking roots. I was involved in mortgage banking and real estate finance. And there was a phenomenon that emerged that had to do with outsourcing a mortgage company back office,
Mm.
because we were back at that time period, we were still very paper intensive. Um, to finance a mortgage loan, you go to your local mortgage broker, Ajax Mortgage, and they do your deal. Well, they are relying on the ability to package that loan and sell it to some upstream secondary market player like Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac, one of
Hmm.
those government agencies, or some private investor institutions that were out there. But you had to transfer that paper. It had to get reviewed. If the buyer didn't like the paper, you had to fix the piece that was missing or incorrect, and it was a very laborious exercise. Anyway, long story short, there was this whole wave of business process outsourcing that sprung up, and there were about 5 companies that emerged doing that in pretty good order and with great result. And mine was one of them. I built my own company to do it, and we started in applying image technology. We were scanning those documents and transferring the images, not the paper.
Right.
And we cut a 45-day process down to 3 days. And, great success. But none of the 5 of us that were operating there, and we informally talked amongst ourselves, none of us could get the scale we really thought was warranted. And when we compared our collective volume of activity versus the whole market of what was going on, we weren't getting there. None of us were
Hmm.
having the wild success we had hoped for. And when the crash of '08 happened, all 5 companies cratered, as did much of the mortgage finance world. I mean, mortgage financing just stopped for 45 days. It did not happen. You
Right.
could not finance a home for a period of time there. And months later, even years later, some of us got back together and we said, is there a chance that we invented a solution that had no problem to solve? You know,
Right.
was the industry really looking for that solution at the time? And our collective postmortem on it was no, not really. The originators of all that mortgage paper felt like they were giving up too much control over their own destiny by outsourcing to players like us. Even though we were producing great results for them, nobody could get over that
Right.
psychology of giving up the control of it. And so, cautionary tale when for those that are out there percolating big ideas, just be careful that you, to your point, do your market research and really understand whether or not the market really wants the great idea that you think you have.
Yeah, we make a lot of assumptions, myself included, as creators, business owners. And I look at my people, I said, you know what? Back in the day in the 80s, there were all these focus groups, two-way mirrors, cushy chairs, a lot of dollars generated. I said, go out into the streets, get on the phone, call your customers and say, what do you wish our product did? What do you wish our service did that we don't currently do? They know. I mean, the genesis, I'm sure you know this, of the whole boarding pass thing with Southwest Airlines 4+ decades ago was they went to the airport and said to people, what would you do? How early would you come here to get a seat that you want? And it wasn't the board of directors that came up with that A group, B group, C group. It was air travelers. And I think even like the iPhone, I think the public got to the point where they said, okay, the next iteration really isn't that much different than the one I have, so I'm going to start backing away. I'm not going to get a new phone every 4 months. And sometimes it's as simple as saying, what do and when I work with companies, I say, ask yourself these 4 questions. Today, what do we have to stop doing? There's something going on here that we know has to stop. What is it? Today, before 5 p.m., what do we have to start doing? Because we've been avoiding it and we know it. Pick one thing and start doing it. One of my favorites is what do we have to keep doing? Because it's easy to beat yourself up and think we're not doing anything right. But then I like to say, what do we have to get back to doing? Because there's always somebody in a company that can say, we used to do this, or when our policy was this. And I'll say, what happened to that? We don't know. It disappeared. It fell into the crack in the table. We don't know where it went. We can't get it out. Maybe it should be revived. Real simple questions to evoke, hopefully, some meaningful full dialogue. A lot of them, quite honestly, the answers to me, at least in my travels, circle around culture. You mentioned culture before. I have like a running debate with some people, including on LinkedIn, and I'm always going to be the guy that says culture trumps strategy every single day. Give me an A culture and a C strategy. We're going to get farther down the football field. Give
Yeah.
me an A strategy and a C culture, and we're not going to make first downs. And I get some people pounding the table going, that's wrong, blah, blah, blah. Well, the truth of the matter is, what I end up saying is a very strong, defined understood, and utilized culture should be a part of your strategy. Not that they're on separate islands, it should be
That's
part of
right.
your operational strategy. And again, when you look at the companies that do the best in their own words, and I always joke and I say to people, the women and men who drive for UPS, FedEx, Amazon, whatever delivery service, they know the most about mission and vision because they see 1,000 frame statements every day in lobbies of businesses. But when you walk into that building and ask the employees in your own words, tell me what's the mission, what's the vision, they don't know. The scarier thing is they might not care. But if you build a culture where the words aren't that significant, but the mindset and the process and the filter is, and then some people said, well, if you hire to your culture, a cultural fit, you're just going to get more of the same thing. And I'm like, no, you don't do that. You hire to raise the bar on your culture. You don't want an army of everyone that thinks like Doug and everyone that thinks like Larry. You want someone to come in and go, Doug and Larry, I understand, but what about this? And I
Right.
think that's what the youngest generations in the workforce are looking for. They want input, they want it early on, they want respect. It doesn't mean you're going to agree with them, but they want to be heard. We all want to be heard. Humans want to be heard. Um, so that's where I land on culture versus strategy. And again, I saw a post on LinkedIn the other night, and I thought it was brilliant. And the gentleman said, anybody who's got a strategic plan in a binder that's 5 years old or more, pull it out, go through every page, call me up and let me know where you saw the pandemic in that plan.
Yeah. Right.
Where was
Wasn't
it?
there? Yep. Yep.
Nobody saw that one coming.
Right. Well, Larry, this has been great. Tell people the best way to get a hold of you if they're interested in knowing more about your work.
You know what? Quite honestly, I'm pretty heavy on social media. If you just Google Leadership Larry or Chief Excuse Obliterator, I actually own that trademark now. Um, you'll find me or find me on LinkedIn. My email is leadershiplarry@gmail.com. My book is available on Amazon and Barnes and Noble if you like one better than the other. But I'm pretty confident that if anybody just Googles Larry Mietus or Leadership Larry, I'm going to come up on the first page and they'll find a way to connect me. My promise to people I speak in front of, I consult, I meet on programs like yours is, if you need an outside opinion, you need a sounding board, you need someone to scream at, call me. As long as I'm alive, I promise I will get back to you. It might not be the same day, and we'll chat and go from there.
That's great. Well, as always, folks, we're going to have that in the show notes. So when you get a minute, hop down, check that out, and check out Larry's other information. But Larry, one last time, thank you, man. This has been really good. I appreciate you being here.
Doug, my pleasure. I appreciate your time.
Well, folks, this is the point of the show. I like to remind you we do have a YouTube version of this show. Same title, Leadership Powered by Common Sense. Hop over there, check out the archives, and leave us a comment. Let us know if you've got an idea or a theme that you would like to hear that we haven't covered, or you've got a recommendation on somebody that should be a guest. Would love to hear from you. If you need to get a hold of me, just go to my website at dougthorpe.com. That's THORPE.com, and I've got a lot of information there, an opportunity for a free discovery call if you'd like to chat about your situation. But with that, we're going to say goodbye. Go out there and make it a great day.
You've been listening to Leadership Powered by Common Sense, hosted by Doug Thorpe. If you would like to know more about the coaching and advisory services he provides, visit dougthorpe.com.